Welcome. My name is Susan Lang. I'm chair of the Sarah and Sam Schofer, the Executive Committee of the Holocaust Resource Center. And this evening, we're here for the Ida E. King Memorial Lecture. And this evening is the 27th annual Memorial Lecture, which was instituted in 1990. And tonight is the first one that is being streamed on Facebook Live. So we have come very far forward. The Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Professor of Holocaust Studies is an endowed chair and is named for the mother of Dr. Vera King Farris, who was a president of Stockton University from 1983 to 2003. She was a visionary who helped develop Stockton's Holocaust Resource Center. And the Ida E. King Distinguished Visiting Professor of Holocaust Studies annually brings to Stockton a different scholar of international reputation to teach and do research in the field of Holocaust studies. And this year, for fall semester of 2017 and spring semester of 2018, that professor is Dr. Alex Alvarez. Dr. Alvarez has taught for years at the Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona, and is the author of many books and articles. His main areas of study are in the fields of collective and interpersonal violence, which includes genocide. His most recent book is the same title as this lecture, Unstable Ground, Climate Change, Borders, and Genocide. This evening's lecture will explore the issue of climate change as it relates to violence and genocide. As the science becomes clearer and the evidence continues to mount, what effect is climate change having on violence, ethnic conflict, and genocide in our world? After the lecture, you will have the opportunity to ask Dr. Alvarez a question. Please write your questions on the 3x5 cards that have been provided to you. And if you don't have a card, please ask one of the ushers. And now, I'd like to present Dr. Alex Alvarez.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? Good. Well, thank you for that introduction. It is a distinct honor and pleasure for me to be here with you tonight and to have this opportunity to speak with you. Before I begin, however, I do wish to thank Gail Rosenthal, Elisa von Joden-Forgy, Judy Vogel, Roz Siegel, Michael Hayes, Marian Hassong, Mike Dickerman, Dean Rob Gregg, Sarah Albertson, and all of the other faculty and staff and board members here at Stockton. It is a privilege for me to be here, to get to know the folks here, to be a part of the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center and the Master of Arts of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Everyone has gone out of their way to welcome me and make me feel a part of this community, and I am deeply honored by that anyway. All right, tonight, I'm afraid, is not going to be the most uplifting talk. But I do hope you find it enlightening and interesting, certainly. And I want to challenge you in a couple of ways. One, I want to challenge you to think about some issues that we often don't like to think about because it is very troubling, because it is very scary in some ways. And I also want to challenge you to think about them in a different kind of way, to make some connections between things that you might think are very separate, very different, but which I believe are very closely connected and which will impact us here in the United States and around the world in the years to come. Climate change has been in the news a lot lately. In fact, earlier this month, on November 2nd, just a few weeks ago, a government report was released that asserted that climate change is extremely likely the result of human activity. And it was the most comprehensive report yet released by U.S. climate scientists, and actually directly challenges some of the assertions from leading members of the administration and Congress who either question the reality of climate change or the influence of human behavior on it. Now, much of the focus of the report was on the environmental consequences of climate change. My guess is this is what most of you think about when you think of climate change. So what images come to mind? Is it perhaps this? Or maybe this. And in many ways, Al Gore and An Inconvenient Truth, or the image of polar bears on melting ice floes, have become iconic images that most of us associate with this topic of climate change. Now, as important as these impacts are, I think we also need to begin realizing that there will be, and there are, human impacts to climate change as well. And every year, the evidence just grows. Climate change is fundamentally altering the world as we know it. Science and even our own experiences increasingly tell us as much. There are new weather patterns developing with increased precipitation in some regions, while other areas have longer and deeper droughts. Now, where I live in the West, fires, especially in the summer dry seasons, have become a huge issue. It's not new, but they certainly seem to have increased in ferocity and in frequency. And if you were paying attention to the news at all this year, looking at the fires in California, this is something that is here now. These are pictures from Santa Rosa, California. On the left here, you have a picture of a neighborhood before the fire and after the fire. And if you live out west, these issues are increasingly becoming the norm. We also know that storm systems are increasing in frequency and severity as well. Think of this past year in regards to hurricanes. Think about Houston and the flooding they experienced in the wake of the hurricane there. This is another image from Houston as well. Now, whether or not any particular storm or any particular weather event is the result of climate change is something that could be debated. But nevertheless, all of these are increasingly making us think about the consequences of climate change on our society and our world. Now, we need to remember, especially when we look at this kind of image, that sea level rise is something that is impacting shorelines, and storm surges increasingly threaten many coastal communities. We need to also know that half of the people on Earth now live within 60 miles of a shoreline. And in fact, a new report was just released suggesting that Antarctica's glaciers are more vulnerable than previously thought to rapid collapse. And if true, it means that most coastal cities will be flooded by the end of the century. James Hansen, one of the preeminent climate scientists, suggests that if this is indeed the case, by 2065, sea level rise could be at 10 feet. Most of the largest world cities on Earth are in coastal areas. Slowly, ever so slowly, we're beginning to wake up to this reality and to some of the potential dangers. We need to understand that climate change will test the ability of human communities to cope and adapt. Change is always stressful for individuals, certainly for me, but also for communities. And as our world warms, societies around the world have to confront this new reality. And tonight, I want to talk with you about some of the ways in which those altered circumstances will heighten the risk for the development of communal and ethnic violence, war, and genocide. Now, while a talk like this is by necessity somewhat speculative, it is grounded in what we do know about conflict, war, and genocide. We know a lot about the etiology and dynamics of conflict and violence, the connection between resources and conflict, the role of xenophobia, prejudice, and intolerance in facilitating violence and persecution. And we can look back at history at climate-facilitated fighting, wars, genocide throughout history, from the ancient Anasazi to the Maya, to the Egyptians, to the Mongols, the Vikings, and countless other societies where climate change played a role in their rise and sometimes in their violent fall. The scholarship of genocide and conflict has a lot to teach us about the ways in which communities can react when confronted with crisis and threat. Even here in the United States, we're acknowledging this more and more. In 2015, the Pentagon, not the most progressive of institutions, issued a report asserting that climate change represents an urgent and growing threat to U.S. national security. And the reason they argue this is because they believe that it will create continuous and ongoing stresses. In other words, it's not just about one event, one change. It's about these things happening together, in sequence, sometimes amplifying the effects of each other. Accumulating over time, they will erode the ability of any particular state to cope and adapt. Now, to cope with these kinds of long-term challenges, and I will say, we can cope. We do have that ability that I will talk about a bit later. But to do so will require a lot of social, economic, and political resiliency, as well as a willingness to adapt. But these vary. They vary depending on geography, on resources, on wealth, as well as on the social, the political, the economic, and the religious structures and institutions that often guide our choices and our beliefs. Looking around the world, we find, for example, there are certain regions that are at higher risk than others, that are considered to have low resiliency, low ability to cope and adapt. Large regions of Africa, for example, are considered to be at high risk. If we look at North Africa, for example, they're considered to be at high risk because of environmental fragility, as well as endemic and widespread poverty. West Africa is also considered to be at high risk because of widespread political corruption, as well as a long-standing history of ethnic conflict. On the other hand, Europe and North America are considered to be at relatively low risk because of high resiliency and adaptive capacity. We have stable political systems, we have wealth, we have resources, we have infrastructures that will help us move supplies and resources where they're needed. Nations with those kinds of resources will usually have the ability to meet the needs of a changing climate. Poorer nations, not so much. In fact, poor nations will face a situation in which resource loss leads to violent conflict, which in turn will further reduce resources and deepen the inability of communities to cope, thus potentially leading to more risk of conflict. Essentially, we're talking about a spiral of violence. This doesn't mean, however, that the industrialized world will be off the hook or that it will be able to cope easily or well always. Think about how the United States handled Hurricane Katrina. You had this one weather event, local government collapsed with a resulting breakdown in law and order. The governor gave a shoot-to-kill order to the National Guard to suppress looting. Evacuation of the population was sporadic and mismanaged and led to many unnecessary deaths. Keep in mind, this was one event, a single event in one of the wealthiest nations on earth. More recently, we could point to how well the United States has handled the situation in Puerto Rico and the difficulties we've experienced there in terms of trying to bring aid and assistance and vital supplies to that place. And that's in 2017. Climate change, in other words, will test the ability of governments to maintain security and social order, as well as provide shelter, food, potable water, all of the things that a government needs to do in order to maintain the legitimacy in the eyes of its population. Those states that are unsuccessful in meeting these demands risk failing and allowing social disorder to escalate into violence as competition and conflict intensify. And there are plenty of examples that illustrate the dangers of state failure for conflict, war, and genocide. In the mid-1990s, for example, state failure in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, what is now that country, resulted in a civil war that has resulted to date in about 5.4 million deaths, and a region where sexual assault is widespread. That conflict was subsequently used by adjacent countries to gain access to the Congo's natural resources. Ironically, this entire situation was triggered in large part by the genocide in neighboring Rwanda, spilling over its borders as refugees from the violence sought to flee from the genocide by spilling over into refugee camps in the DRC, They were soon followed by perpetrators of the genocide as they began losing the civil war that helped spawn the genocide in the first place. And the resulting turmoil and conflict destabilized the entire region, resulting in a failed state that continues to consume the largest UN peacekeeping force to date, and where the kinds of issues I've just talked about still continue to this day. State failure isn't the only pathway connecting climate change and violent conflict. There are plenty of other risk factors, and we don't have time, and I don't want to go into all of those at this point, but they include things like ongoing or pre-existing conflicts that escalate into genocidal violence because the stakes are suddenly so much higher. Preemptive wars begun as defensive measures, get them before they get you. Conflicts arising out of the desire to protect scarce resources or to acquire new ones. Keep in mind, part of the reason why neighboring states went into the Democratic Republic of the Congo initially was to basically deal with the unrest and the violence. But over time, their missions often changed where they began exploiting the resources in the Congo for their own purposes. The DRC is a resource-rich place, and many of the surrounding neighbors saw in that conflict, in the failure of that government, an opportunity to harvest resources that they've used for their own populations. Resources have often sparked wars in the past and may do so again as states struggle to cope and deal with the challenges of resource loss in the face of climate change. In the present day, diminishing resources such as water have already heightened tensions and conflicts between communities and nations. Now here, especially in New Jersey, where I come from in Arizona, water is an issue and you're constantly being made aware of how scarce it is. But even in Arizona, we build golf courses in the desert. You go to Vegas and there are fountains spewing water endlessly. We don't think twice about turning on the tap and taking long hot baths or watering our lawns or washing our cars. But the reality is that water is one of the single biggest issues in the world today. 70% of the world's surface is covered with water. 97% of the world's water supply is largely unusable to us because it is salt water. Of the remaining 3%, most of it is inaccessible to us. What the world's human population is dealing with is essentially around 0.3% of the world's water supply. The lack of clean, potable water is already the world's leading cause of death, especially among children around the world. And projections suggest that the situation is only going to get worse. Something like 12,000 farmers a year in India in recent years have been committing suicide because of the lack of water and the failure of their family farms. This is not just an abstract theoretical issue. We can even look in other places as well. Think about Syria. Hold on. Think about Syria. The ongoing conflict in Syria can be partially traced to the social and political unrest brought about by a deep drought in the region that began in 2006 and continued through to about, I think it was 2011. Half of the wheat crop, 2/3 of the barley crop was lost during this period. About 1/3 of the livestock was also lost. Keep in mind, 40% of Syrians were employed in agricultural industries or fields. 2 to 3 million Syrians were impacted by this drought. Many of them subsequently left their farms or rural communities for the cities and were very unhappy with the policies of the government in terms of trying to ameliorate the situation. And when the Arab Spring came into the region, they found many young people who were willing to embrace this in order for change. And tragically, it escalated, it devolved into this horrific civil war that continues to this day. We can also look at the Darfur region of the Sudan, because water was at the heart of that genocide. North Darfur is on the edge of the Sahara and is an arid region that is home to tribes whose semi-nomadic lifestyles revolve around their livestock. These people and their herds have often been vulnerable to climatic variations. In fact, there's someone who writes about the Sahara and pictures it like a bellows. During wetter periods, it sucks people in. During drier periods, as the sand dunes advance, as the dry regions move forward, encroaching on grazing lands, it pushes people out. And during drier times, the Sahara moves south into these grazing lands before receding again in wetter periods. Now, South Darfur, on the other hand, tends to be more hospitable, which is why during times of drought, there have often been large-scale migrations from North Darfur to South Darfur. The majority of the tribes in the south practice agricultural lifestyles with fields, small towns, small farms scattered throughout the regions. Now, when fighting broke out in 2003, the government in Khartoum recruited militia known as the Janjaweed from semi-nomadic Arabic tribes in the northern part of the Darfur who were willing to participate because it allowed them the opportunity to get land and water for their livestock through the killing and displacement of tribal groups that stood in their way. Now, there were political calculations as well, military calculations, ethnic stereotypes, long-standing antagonisms that helped create this genocide. But we cannot ignore the role that drought, desertification, and overgrazing played in enabling a situation to come about in which genocide was perpetrated. And in this situation, resources, especially land and water, are at the heart of the violence. Now, in some ways, what I've been painting, this picture I've been painting, begs the question of how does this relate to genocide? And I do believe that there is a link here. First, we know that ethnic conflict, war, and genocide are closely linked. Wars and genocides do not just happen. Even though they're sometimes reported as exploding or erupting because of ancient hostilities, tribal hatreds, old antagonisms, the reality is that wars and genocides start because decisions are made, policies initiated, and troops and populations mobilized. They don't just happen. They are the result of choices made by social, political, and religious leaders who are trying to achieve some goal or goals. Their decision-making is often supported and justified by ideology, by religion, by national motivation and justifications. And when we consider this in light of the projected consequences of climate change on human communities, it paints a dark picture of possibility. History teaches us that wars and other forms of collective conflict have often revolved around resources and territory, power, nationalism, intolerance, and fear. These wars sometimes morph into genocide. Wars make genocide more likely because they facilitate the development of more radical extremist ideologies and practices. War strengthens national feeling. And for members of the in-group, of those who belong to that national community, it's a time of heightened belonging. Think about the patriotism that erupted in this country in the wake of various terrorist attacks and the sense of community that develops. We're all in this together. We're going to get through this together. Communities come together during times of threat. But that also increases the risk for populations who don't belong, who are defined as the enemy or as outsiders. Targeting internal enemies for elimination is the essence of genocide. And during wartime, a state can easily define an outsider or minority population as the enemy and present the persecution and elimination of members of that group as a necessary and important and even patriotic service to that nation. Intolerance of the enemy and violence can become civic virtue. And this is easiest in places where a history of previous conflict and pre-existing prejudices are already present. Pre-existing prejudice can provide a deep well or a reservoir of hostility that can be tapped, that can be exploited when needed. What I always think about when I think about this is where I live in the West, as I mentioned, fire is a huge issue. And what some of my friends who work on some of these forest fires, who work in these hotshot kind of crews, one of their fears is that fires sometimes migrate underground. That you have these flames and they combat the flames in the trees, in the shrubbery, in the growth, but that what happens is that sometimes the fire also goes underneath and smolders away, but it's out of sight. And they think they've got the fire licked, they're doing okay, but you get the right conditions, dry conditions, windy conditions, and those embers smoldering underground can flare into life again. And when I think about prejudice, that's what I think about. We think we've got it licked, we think we've taken care of things like anti-Semitism, racism, and other kinds of prejudices. And then you get the right kind of situations, the right environment, and the right people willing to exploit them, and they can flare back up again. Think about how these kinds of processes may play out in a nation struggling to cope with the demands imposed by a changing environment and confronting diminished resources and refugee populations. In that kind of scenario, it's easy to understand how violent conflict may radicalize into programs of expulsion and ultimately even of extermination. We also know the criminological research tells us that during troubled times, punitive attitudes and punitive opinions among a population tend to develop, grow, and harden. We get reactive. When we get scared, we want to get tough. We become much more supportive of punitive attitudes and policies on the part of our leaders. Political leaders can easily capitalize on these kind of feelings to implement more repressive policies. Uncertainty and fear breed intolerance and hostility, especially against those perceived to be outsiders, those who are different, and especially if they're seen as unfairly benefiting from a society. And we see these kind of processes already playing out when we examine the issue of population migration and displacement. In many parts of the world, including the United States, we see a hostile backlash developing against refugee populations. Here in the United States, we are already engaged in a process of what criminologists refer to as crimmigration, the criminalization of immigration. This is the U.S.-Mexico border in Nogales, Arizona. You have on the left the United States, on the right Mexico. You can't really see it through the trees, but on the left there's a neighborhood, and there are plenty of neighborhoods like this where for generations there was nothing dividing these two countries, and people mingled freely back and forth across the border. And now their homes look out at this steel fence that divides this border. Similar kinds of things are happening in Europe as well. In response to the wave of migration beginning in 2015, Europe has had a hard time absorbing and coping with the massive surge of refugees. Language, religious, and cultural differences have served to compound the difficulties. And consequently, Europe is undergoing a deep backlash. Now, Europe is far more diverse today than when I was growing up there in the 1960s and 70s. Yet this increased diversity has not been embraced by all Europeans. There are strong and enduring undercurrents of suspicion and intolerance. One recent survey found that most immigrants, even those who have been there for many years, remain poorly integrated into many European societies and often face widespread racism and discrimination. Now, what's ironic about this backlash is that European Union nations have often championed progressive policies and attitudes in regards to human rights and towards specifically refugee populations. Moreover, since the 1990s, Europe had been moving towards the removal of borders and walls internally. Now, tragically, the external European border is the most dangerous in the world, with thousands upon thousands of deaths, especially among those trying to cross the Mediterranean. Now, keep in mind, European economies have been largely stagnant in recent years, and this sense of economic malaise, uncertainty about jobs, has contributed to some of the bubbling up, if you will, of these deep-seated fears, the nationalism, the racism that we are increasingly seeing. This has been amplified by terrorist attacks in places like London, Paris, Nice, Munich, and Brussels, and these have further aggravated prejudice and hostility. And we've seen a dramatic shift in a lot of European countries in their attitudes towards these refugee populations. Far-right political parties have made significant electoral gains in a number of European countries: Germany, France, the Netherlands, Greece, Hungary, Sweden, Austria, and Slovakia, to name some of them. And all too often, these attitudinal and legislative changes have also resulted in anti-immigrant violence. Clearly, border issues and large-scale population movement are volatile sources of tension and potential conflict. Now, granted, the limited violence and overt hostility that we've seen to date is still a far cry from genocide, in which entire groups are targeted for elimination. But it is still deeply worrying nonetheless. And it is precisely those kind of attitudes and that kind of persecution which can turn into something more widespread, more systematic, more deadly. Now, how are these kind of tensions going to play out in the coming years? We do know that climate change is expected to dramatically accelerate the issue of forced displacement. The numbers are going to increase hugely. Now, history is full of examples of population displacement and migration. What is unprecedented, however, is the scale and scope of what is expected. During the 1990s, somewhere around 25 million people were displaced because of environmental degradation, because of natural disasters and the like. 25 million. By the year 2050, some projections suggest that as many as 700 million people may be on the move. The International Organization for Migration takes a more conservative approach and places the probable number at around 200 million. 200 million people. A report released earlier this month in November suggests that climate change will create the world's biggest refugee crisis ever. We have to understand just how massive a problem that will present, and the amount of suffering and trauma these impersonal numbers really represent. These are all human beings who are going to be forced from their homes, from their communities, from their regions. Let's look at a comparison. In the modern era, the largest single displacement of people occurred in Europe after the Second World War and involved anywhere from 40 to 66 million people. That huge movement of people was spawned by war, genocide, deportations, forced labor, death, and destruction. And what it meant was that it continued and contributed to years of social unrest, tremendous amounts of violence, civil war, revolution that lasted for many, many years after the official end of hostilities in 1945. Yet those numbers will be dwarfed by the size of population dislocation expected to occur as a consequence of climate change. Large segments of the impoverished developing world, largely dependent on agriculture, prone to political corruption and violent conflict, are the most vulnerable to climate shocks. Their populations will represent the bulk of those displaced. Now, what's a terrible irony of the global landscape is that those least responsible for climate change will be those most impacted by it. At times, people will be forced from their homes by natural disasters, things like tornadoes, cyclones, hurricanes, and other extreme weather events that are, as I indicated earlier, expected to increase in frequency and severity. That kind of migration is often referred to as distressed or forced or survival migration. Other times, the causes for population shifts will be slower. It'll arrive more gradually in the form of chronic problems that are just getting worse over time. Drought that never seems to end, less reliable monsoon rains and farms failing and those kind of things. Keep in mind, agriculture is the source of survival for about 85% of rural people around the world. And in some locations, such as much of Africa, over 80% of the population is rural, 90% of whom are subsistence-level farmers. Issues such as environmental degradation, increasing levels of soil salinity, and desertification can progressively force those in those impacted areas to leave for better regions. And what reception will they receive? Think of Bangladesh, which is expected to experience both temporary flooding from storm surges and permanent loss of land from sea level rise. Bangladesh essentially is a very low-lying country because it is largely a river delta. And it already historically has suffered from flooding from cyclones moving up the Bay of Bengal. What happens when much of their land is already underwater? Now keep in mind, not only is Bangladesh vulnerable to flooding from sea level rise, it is also suffering from drought because neighboring India has dammed off much of the water supply, many of the rivers, because they need it for their own agricultural enterprises. Where will these people go? Inland? India? India is already building a wall, and there's a long history of conflict between the two peoples. Ironically, Bangladesh is already dealing with refugees from neighboring Myanmar. The Rohingya have been streaming across the border and facing mounting hostility and violence within Bangladesh, and actually helping move the Bangladesh government into a more authoritarian posture relative to the refugee populations. Another important source of population displacement will be war and genocide. Conflict has always caused displacement. Populations try to flee the violence. People want to get away from the death and destruction. In point of fact, research demonstrates that political violence, especially two kinds, genocide and civil war, are the most significant sources of large-scale population displacement. Now, sometimes refugees are not just a byproduct of war and genocide, but are actually a central strategy of the violence. In Bosnia, for example, during the 1990s, Bosnian Serb paramilitaries and army forces sought to ethnically cleanse territory through torture, sexual assault, and mass murder. Ethnic cleansing. In the Sudan, the forcible displacement of members of African tribes from their farms was a central goal of the genocide. The connection between forcible displacement and violent conflict can also operate in reverse order. Sometimes forced displacement is not an outcome, but it's one of the causes. Research examining the relationship between war and migration patterns has found that a ripple effect sometimes occurs. When conflicts erupt, people try to flee it, they move into neighboring countries and regions, and in turn destabilize those societies, those areas, thus sparking more conflict and refugees. Refugees, in other words, can sometimes spread the seeds of violent conflict as they travel outward. Immigrant groups can also become a focal point around which hostility can develop, especially if the new arrivals are visibly identifiable as being different or are portrayed as representing some danger. That threat might be as simple as believing they're putting an unnecessary strain on resources, or something existential. Their existence here poses a threat to our people, our way of life, at some deeper, more fundamental level. Popular sentiment and anger can easily coalesce against groups defined as being different or as representing a threat. And in the past, we know politicians and demagogues have often exploited fear, anger, and prejudice in order to advance their own agendas. We want answers, and we want answers that make sense to us. And sometimes the answer about these impersonal forces, they don't resonate, they don't make sense to us, we don't understand them. But when you tell me that group or this group over here is responsible for why my life is tougher, why I'm scared, that's something that resonates emotionally. Scapegoating is a powerful tool. And again, this kind of process is made easier where long-standing beliefs, antipathies have wide currency. And just as Hitler and the Nazis scapegoated the Jews for Germany's defeat in the First World War, the collapse of the German economy during the Great Depression, so too others may blame vulnerable populations for the problems of a particular place and time. And in point of fact, genocide scholars have long identified tough times as one common factor leading up to the genocidal impulse because of the kinds of attitudes that they foster. Now, the importance of these kinds of issues become clear when we focus on border regions. In the boundary zones between nations, we have often seen nationalism, ideology, ethnicity, and religion, and other drives and ambitions and rivalries play out in violent and destructive ways. The geographic convergence of political and social boundaries creates frontier regions, and it puts states, diverse populations, and variable resources in close proximity to each other. And in the past, this has sometimes resulted in friction, hostility, and competing claims for territory, resources, and populations. They have also influenced the social geography of movements and beliefs that imagine a nation or a region free of the physical presence of some population. This is the essence of genocide. It's about reimagining a landscape in which all members of a particular group have been removed, and then attempting to bring that vision into reality. It's about a vision of purity, in which the social and physical landscape is free of the polluting presence of certain groups. And border zones, because they are zones of interaction and are usually demographically diverse, tend to be seen as particularly dangerous areas of this kind of pollution. It's no accident that some historians, for example, refer to this region of Europe as the Bloodlands. And although we often view them as being static and unchanging, borders are also often fluid and contain contested boundaries that shift over time. Borders change. The historic claims, however, to land, to people, are often not forgotten. And as states confront climate change, as they look at the resources of neighboring countries, the solutions they envision may well be informed by ideas of historic territorial loss. It may be not just about resources, but about reclaiming lost land. Border areas are also where national security and state interests collide with international relations. A number of years ago, I was giving a presentation in Lithuania to a group of scholars about border zones and risk factors, and one of the areas I pointed out as a potential risk area was the Ukraine, because the Ukraine has always been defined as being essential to Russian national security. It's within its sphere of interest, and it's seen as a buffer state between the former Soviet states and Western Europe. I wasn't laughed at, but certainly I was poo-pooed, that this is ridiculous. Why are you bringing this up? And yet, what we know today, the current situation in the Crimea and eastern Ukraine especially, speak to the ways in which border issues can play out in very dangerous and violent ways. Geography, then, can be intimately linked with climate change, conflict, and genocide on a number of different levels. Now, I feel kind of this pall descended over the room. Don't worry, I'm going to have someone come by in a few minutes passing out antidepressants for you. I feel a little bit like, for any Leonard Cohen fans out there, the grocer of despair, right? But this discussion has not been meant to assert that this image I'm portraying is inevitable. In many ways, this presentation has been an exercise in examining potential outcomes and worst-case scenarios. And I'll be honest, I think they're frightening, absolutely frightening. The possibilities of state failure, resource scarcity, food and water shortages, mass population displacement leading to xenophobic hostility, persecution, rioting, pogroms, civil war, and genocide are very real consequences. But we need to remember that we live in a world of probabilities, not of certainties. Such outcomes are not preordained. Violence, both individual and collective, is highly contingent. Violence is never inevitable. It is the end result, both individually as well as collectively, of a series of choices and actions. And at many stages, violence can be avoided. The specific ways in which climate change plays out in the coming years will depend on the precise impacts in different locations and the localized, regional, national, and international reactions, choices, calculations made by individuals, communities, nations, and their leaders. Violence, we have to remind ourselves, is not the only response during difficult times. Communities can come together to support, to assist, and to collaborate in seeking solutions to problems. The writer Sebastian Junger came out with a book recently called Tribes. And in that, he points out different examples after earthquakes, the London Blitz, times when populations came together, difference was put aside, and everyone pulled together for the common good. These things are possible. Crisis can bring out the best in people. We also shouldn't forget that for all of its violent conflicts and problems, the world today is a safer and less violent place than it has ever been before. We have made great strides. This is encouraging, to say the least, since it strongly suggests that humanity is not predestined to an existence marked only by conflict, war, and genocide. In 1990, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats wrote a poem he titled The Second Coming, in which he wrote the following lines. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And in many ways, Yeats' imagery provides a powerful allegory, I think, for the consequences of humanity failing to meet, to cope with the challenges of a changing climate. The world he imagined is a harsh and a violent one. But for all of our faults as a species, we are remarkably versatile. We are adaptable, we are creative, we are resilient. These are all qualities that can and will stand us in good stead. The trick is to find ways to resist the leaders, the processes, and the mentalities that have been shown to lead to intolerance, violence, and conflict, and to nurture and foster and accelerate those that lead to cooperation, to tolerance, and to nonviolent solutions. In many ways, our future quite literally depends on it. And with that, I will end it. Thank you. So there are cards?
Yep.
How does this work?
I think that we're going to collect some cards. If any of you have them, any questions for Dr. Alvarez, he's happy to answer.
No?
What can we do to encourage our government to become proactive in preventing or reducing global change?
So the question is, what can we do to prevent or to get our government to be more proactive?
Correct.
get engaged, get involved. I think one of the acid tests for me in terms of how I vote, who I support, is in regards to people who are running for office, their attitudes in regards to climate change. We cannot keep dragging our feet, pretending this doesn't exist, or to suggest that the world has always been warming, it's always been changing, so we really don't need anything to worry about. I think there are many ways we can get involved, and I think actually getting involved is one of the things we need to be doing if we are going to continue to live in a participatory democracy. It is about getting involved in the processes and making sure that we as a citizenry, as individuals, that we support leaders who are willing to engage and make sure that we are ready and prepared and willing to shoulder some of the challenges and crises that we are increasingly confronting.
I know that you suggested some, but what are other solutions? What can an individual do?
What can an individual do? Honestly, I think this is bigger than any one individual. And in fact, climate change at this point is inevitable. The changes we're experiencing today are not as a result of what we're doing now. And by the way, just this past year, carbon dioxide emissions increased once again after a few years of relative stability. Honestly, if we want to make true, lasting impact, we have to mobilize, we have to organize, we have to act collectively in terms of making sure we as a nation are in the forefront of solutions rather than hindering the processes. We can recycle, we can try to increase our own awareness, we can be careful about the resources we consume and we use, but the reality is those choices make a minuscule impact in terms of the forces that are going on today. And I'm not trying to discount them or minimize them, but I would argue that their greatest value is in changing our mindsets about how we inhabit this planet. In other words, to make us more aware that the lifestyles that we enjoy in many ways are largely unsustainable, and they've come at a cost. Because the lifestyles we enjoy here, for example, have been largely because of the ways in which we have exploited the resources around the world. And those nations are the ones who are facing the most catastrophic consequences of climate change with the fewest resources. We don't have just I think, a practical obligation to confront this. I think we also have a moral obligation. Unfortunately, what I see happening is much of the developed world is wanting to build a wall and a moat separating us, protect what we have, from all of those other people out there. And that's exactly the wrong way to go with this.
From reading the newspapers, it almost seems as if most of the Western European governments, which would be the most helpful in getting on board with climate change, appear to be moving right because of the migrants coming in
Right.
and the xenophobia
Right.
in the area. And so I think the pendulum seems like it's swinging in the opposite direction right now. How do we move that?
How do we, well, that's the question, isn't it? Because much of this is about othering. It is about difference and the ways in which we as societies, as individuals, as communities, the way in which we confront the other, people who are different from us. And the problem is when we are scared, when we are nervous, when we are uncertain about our own survival, our own resources, our own well-being, we tend to get suspicious and we tend to get reactionary. That's what, people who study genocide, people who study the Holocaust, that's what we've been struggling with for many, many years. How do we get past those kinds of that kind of intolerance, that kind of prejudice. I don't know what the answer is. I don't think there is an answer. There are many things we can do that we are doing in terms of education, in terms of outreach, in terms of bringing people together, in terms of creatively looking for solutions. The problem is not that this is something unprecedented, in fact, dealing with other communities coming in. What is unprecedented is the scale. That's at the numbers, and that's where so much of this is coming from. Illegal immigration, it did not start in 2008 in the United States. But what else was going on in 2008 that made people suddenly much more aware? Was it economic insecurity? Was it changing demographic patterns that made people feel uncomfortable and uneasy? I wish I had a good answer. I wish I could say, here's the magic silver bullet that's going to take care of this. I don't know that there is one. But in terms of making a significant impact, for my money, I think it's about getting involved in the political process and making sure that the folks who are making big choices that have big impacts, that they're folks who are doing things in ways that acknowledge this and are addressing it proactively.
That's a big, good luck.
I know.
Again, this question addresses just what we were discussing. How do we convince people we must do what's right, not what's the easiest, and not what is basically best for us necessarily, but best for everybody?
Well, again, I think there's a couple of reasons. One, we cannot wall ourselves off from the rest of the world. It's just not going to happen. We can't do it. Our lifestyles, our technological societies depend on engagement with the world for resources, for capital, and I don't mean just things. I'm talking about human capital as well. So there's a pragmatic reason why we have to be engaged and why we have to address this. But I also believe there's a moral obligation. We live a very privileged lifestyle in this country. It may not always feel that way, but it truly is, especially when you look at the conditions in the developing world. And part of the reason why we have that is because of policies, economic arrangements that have allowed us to exploit resources and to consume. There's a moral reason why we also have to, I think, address the world.
And this question, again, gets to what we were just talking about. You mentioned that communities come together in times of a threat, in times of terrorism, in times of natural disasters, but how do you address instances, which we were just discussing, when communities coming together escalates aggression and encourages violence against other communities, as is happening really around the world right now?
Again, that's that question that is so hard to answer. How do we have people accept folks coming into their communities who speak a different language, who look different, who don't fit in, who members of whom sometimes engage in terrorism? This is what Europe is struggling with right now. You had large numbers of immigrants, what was it, something like 1 million in Germany in approximately 1 year. And then you had some terrorist events, and that just compounded people's reactions. It confirmed their worst fears and prejudices, and they felt empowered to act on those. How do you bring communities together? How do you eliminate ancient hostility and prejudice? I thought here in the United States we had made great strides in confronting anti-Semitism, in racism, and so forth. This year has shown that much of that was an illusion or was superficial. On the other hand, people are engaged, are mobilized in a way I have not seen them for 20 years.
On the other hand, the divide between those people has grown more than we've seen it.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Just
I don't think there's an answer, as I've said. I also don't think there's a short-term solution. I think it will require a lot of hard work. And the problem is the window is closing fast. The time frame in which we can meaningfully make changes to prevent some of the worst consequences, that window, that opportunity is shrinking rapidly. I read something fairly recently that climate scientists are increasingly seeking treatment for depression. In other words, the things we study typically are often seen as this, theoretical or abstract, or it's just something what you do. But it's hitting home among people who really study and take this seriously. And what I find somewhat heartening is that it feels as if we are waking up. We are beginning to have these conversations. We're beginning to acknowledge that these things are happening. We're beginning to ask those questions. I just wish we could accelerate that process a little bit. So to prevent this kind of thing from happening, so that you can just look at me as like, yeah, that guy, kind of gloom and doom scenario, glass half empty kind of guy, which my kids already think, but that's a different issue. Anyway, any other questions? No? A lot to think about, I hope. As I said, I know it's heavy stuff, I know it's bleak, but I do hope you don't walk away from here feeling that there's nothing that can be done. I think there are reasons for hope. There are reasons to believe that we can confront this. All of human history, in part, has been about confronting change and crisis. We just need to get our act together and begin to work on this.
I thank you so much for
Thank
bringing
you.
this interesting discussion. I think you've given us a lot to think about. That's a different approach and a different possible solution if everybody works together for that. And I thank you so much for that. I encourage you all to go onto Facebook and friend the Sam and Sarah Schofer Holocaust Resource Center, new to Facebook, and you can follow and learn when we are going to have interesting speakers and events going on at the center and what the center is doing. And again, it's a way to promote tolerance and take one step forward. So thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
the evening.